The rain battered against my bedroom window, a relentless cascade that seemed to drown the entire world in its fury. Thunder rolled in the distance, low and ominous, rumbling through the small coastal town like the growl of some slumbering beast. I had always loved storms. There was something soothing in their chaos. But that night, something felt different. The air was thick, charged, carrying an unease that settled heavy in my chest. I tried to focus on the book in my lap, but my eyes kept drifting to the window, to the world beyond the glass, where shadows danced in the rain. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the storm, a flash of lightning catching on the horizon. But it wasn't. It was steady, unwavering, a beam of light cutting through the darkness from the cliffs to the north, where the old lighthouse stood. It shouldn't have been possible. The lighthouse had been abandoned for decades, its light extinguished long before I was born. But there it was, bright and unyielding, piercing through the rain like an unspoken summons. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but I couldn't. My gaze was locked on that light, drawn to it in a way that defied explanation. It wasn't just light. It was alive, pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat. I stumbled to my feet, the book tumbling to the floor, forgotten. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with a message from Mark. "You see it too?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. The light was pulling me, calling me, and no amount of reason could silence the gnawing need to go to it. By the time I grabbed my jacket and stepped out into the storm, I knew I wasn't the only one who felt it. The light was a beacon, and it wasn't just calling to me. The walk to the cliffs felt longer than usual. The rain lashed against my skin, cold and sharp, and the wind howled through the trees like a chorus of unseen voices. Every step felt heavier, the pull of the lighthouse growing stronger with each passing second. When I finally reached the base of the cliff, I saw them, Mark, Elena, and Dylan, already waiting. Their faces pale and drawn, their eyes fixed on the beam of light above. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence between us was loud enough, filled with unspoken questions and a shared sense of dread. Together, we climbed the winding path that led to the top, our footsteps muffled by the storm, our breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. The closer we got, the louder the storm seemed to grow, as if the very air around us was protesting our approach. The lighthouse loomed before us, its structure dark and imposing against the stormy sky. The door, heavy and rusted, creaked open with an almost human groan as we pushed it inward. The air inside was cold, stale, carrying the faint scent of salt and decay. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating walls covered in peeling paint and patches of mold. The beam of light that had drawn us there was nowhere to be seen, and yet we could feel it, the pulse of it, the weight of it pressing against us like an invisible hand. Elena's flashlight flickered, the beam trembling as it swept across the room. Her breath hitched, and I followed her gaze to the far corner where a figure stood, shrouded in shadow. My heart lurched, a cold, visceral panic seizing me. But when the light steadied, there was nothing there, just an old coat rack, its tattered fabric swaying slightly in the draught. We pressed on, climbing the spiral staircase that wound upward into the heart of the lighthouse. The air grew colder with every step, the sound of the storm fading until all that remained was the echo of our footsteps and the faint rhythmic hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The higher we climbed, the more distorted the space around us became. The walls seemed to curve unnaturally, the steps narrowing and stretching in ways that defied logic. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move just beyond its beam. A flicker of motion that disappeared as quickly as it had come. When we reached the top, the room was empty. The glass walls of the lantern room were cracked and fogged. The machinery that once powered the light rusted and broken. And yet, the hum was louder here, vibrating through the air, through my chest, as if the lighthouse itself was alive. Mark was the first to notice it. A journal, weathered and torn, resting on a table near the center of the room. He picked it up, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. The writing was frantic, scrawled in uneven lines that spoke of desperation. The words blurred together as I read over his shoulder, but one phrase stood out, repeated over and over again. "Keep the light on. Keep them out." A sudden crash echoed through the room, and we spun around, our flashlights darting wildly. The shadows seemed thicker now, moving in ways they shouldn't, pressing closer, circling us like predators stalking prey. The hum grew louder, sharper, and the light we had come to find, blazed to life. It wasn't just light, it was wrong. It burned too brightly, searing into my eyes even as I looked away. It filled the room, flooding every corner, every shadow, with a brilliance that felt alive, suffocating. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone, plunging the room into darkness. The hum stopped. Leon stopped. The storm outside fell silent, and in that silence I heard it, a whisper, soft and chilling, like the rustle of leaves on a still night. It came from everywhere and nowhere, threading through the air, wrapping around us like a noose. "You shouldn't have come." Oh, I froze, the words sinking into my mind like hooks. The shadows were moving again, faster now, their shapes more defined, more human. But they weren't human. They couldn't be. Their forms were wrong, too tall, too thin, their movements jerky and unnatural, their hollow eyes fixed on us with a hunger that made my blood run cold. And then they lunged. The air inside the lighthouse grew heavier, pressing against my chest with every shallow breath. My flashlight beam jittered across the room, illuminating nothing but cracked walls and decaying wood. The whisper still echoed in my head, chilling and intimate, as if it had been spoken directly into my thoughts. My hands shook, and I gripped the flashlight tighter, trying to focus, trying to keep moving. But my legs felt rooted to the spot. The shadows didn't lunge immediately. They lingered at the edges of the light, flickering and pulsing, their forms barely more than suggestions. It was like they were waiting, feeding off our fear, savoring it. One of them shifted closer, its movements wrong, too fluid, too silent, and I felt my body lock up, a primal terror anchoring me in place. Elena was the first to scream. The sound snapped through the suffocating quiet like a gunshot. She stumbled back, her flashlight falling from her hands and clattering to the floor. The beam spun wildly, casting distorted shadows that stretched and twisted across the room. The figures surged forward at the sound, their forms flickering and jagged, like something glimpsed through static. Mark grabbed Elena, pulling her away from the nearest shadow just as it lunged. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, impossibly long, its hollow face tilted toward her like it was studying her, deciding. I didn't see where Dylan had gone. My focus narrowed to the glowing journal, still clutched in Mark's hand. The words, "Keep the light on," burned into my brain. The shadows didn't make noise. They didn't growl, didn't shriek. They were silent as death, their movements barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. One of them was inches from me now, its empty, faceless head tilting sharply, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Its presence was overwhelming, a void that seemed to pull everything around it into darkness. Into darkness. My flashlight flickered, the beam faltering, and I felt the air around me shift, colder, heavier. Then the light returned. It was sudden, violent, blazing to life, in the center of the room, with an intensity that forced me to shield my eyes. The shadows recoiled, their forms collapsing and scattering like smoke, caught in a gust of wind. The journal in Mark's hand flared with the same light, the pages glowing faintly as if they were alive. "What the hell is happening?" Mark's voice was raw, panicked, cutting through the tension. Elena clung to him, her breaths ragged and shallow, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting the shadows to reappear at any moment. I wanted to answer him, to offer some kind of reassurance, but the words wouldn't come. My gaze was fixed on the light, its pulsing glow, mesmerizing and wrong. It wasn't just light, it was alive, radiating something I couldn't explain, something ancient and cold. The shadows hadn't disappeared. They were still there, circling the edges of the light like vultures, waiting for their moment to strike. "We need to go," Dylan said, his voice tight, his eyes wide. He was near the stairs, his flashlight pointed at the spiral steps leading back down. The light didn't reach the staircase. It was swallowed by the dark, the shadows shifting and writhing just beyond its edge. But staying wasn't an option. The light pulsed again, brighter this time, and I felt it deep in my chest, in my bones. It wasn't protecting us. It was holding them back, but only barely, only for now. I moved toward the stairs, my legs trembling, my grip on the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. The others followed, their footsteps hesitant, every movement slow and deliberate, as if sudden motion would shatter whatever fragile barrier kept the shadows at bay. We descended in silence, the hum of the light growing fainter. With every step, the shadows pressed close, their presence suffocating, their movements barely visible in the flickering beams of our flashlights. The air grew colder, sharper, and I felt the weight of their gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting. At the base of the stairs, the door to the lantern room slammed shut behind us. The sound echoed through the tower, loud and final, and the shadows withdrew, their forms slipping into the walls, into the cracks and crevices where the light couldn't reach. I didn't know if we were safe. I didn't think we ever could be. Elena whimpered, her voice barely audible. What were those things? I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We stumbled out into the storm, the rain colder than before, the wind biting against my skin like tiny daggers. The lighthouse loomed above us, its light still blazing against the darkness, but now it felt like an accusation, a warning. We weren't meant to be here. We made it to the base of the cliff before Dylan stopped, his flashlight darting wildly through the rain. "Where's the path?" he asked, his voice tight with panic. I froze. I froze. He was right. The path we'd taken to get here, the narrow trail that wound its way up the cliffside, was gone. The ground where it had been was smooth, undisturbed, as if it had never existed. The storm raged around us, the wind howling like a living thing, and I felt the weight of the lighthouse light on my back, pressing me down, urging me to turn around. Mark dropped the journal. Liumway, Piugweskan, I. It landed in the mud, its pages open to a scrawled map of the lighthouse and the surrounding cliffs. But the map wasn't right. The lines shifted and twisted, forming shapes that shouldn't exist, paths that led nowhere. And in the center of it all was the lighthouse, its light pulsing faintly on the page, just as it did in the storm. "We're trapped," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't leave." The light above us flared again, brighter, sharper, cutting through the storm with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The shadows were watching, waiting, and somewhere in the distance I heard it, the whisper, soft and chilling, threading through the rain. "It's not done with us." The storm had taken on a life of its own, the wind screaming through the cliffs, with a ferocity that shook the ground beneath us. Rain lashed against my face, cold and relentless, and the light from the lighthouse cast long, distorted shadows across the jagged rocks. The others were silent now, their breaths shallow and uneven, their faces pale in the weak glow of our flashlights. We stood huddled together, staring at the spot where the path should have been. It wasn't just missing. It had never existed. I turned slowly, my flashlight sweeping across the barren ground, searching for any sign of an escape. But the storm had swallowed everything. The world beyond the lighthouse was a wall of rain and darkness, endless and unyielding. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it louder than the howling wind, louder than the distant hum of the light above. "It's not possible," Dylan muttered, his voice trembling. He was gripping his flashlight so tightly that his knuckles were white, his hands shaking. "We came up that path. I remember it." "So do I," Elena said, her voice barely audible. She clutched her jacket tightly around her, her eyes darting to the lighthouse behind us. The light pulsed faintly, a rhythmic beat that seemed to echo in my head. "But it's gone. It's just gone." Mark picked up the journal from where it had fallen, the pages slick with rain. He held it under the weak beam of his flashlight, his brow furrowed as he flipped through the waterlogged paper. "Ambiance, this doesn't make any sense," he said, his voice shaking. "It talks about the light, about keeping it on, but it doesn't say anything about this." I didn't want to look at the journal. I didn't want to see the twisted map again, the lines that shifted and writhed like something alive. But I couldn't stop myself. My gaze drifted to the page, and there it was. The lighthouse, a perfect circle at the center, with pathways spiraling outward like veins. Except now, the lines were darker, bolder, and the paths all led back to the same place. The door at the base of the tower. "We have to go back," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. They felt wrong, heavy, like they didn't belong to me. But as soon as I said them, I knew they were true. The lighthouse wasn't just a building. It was something else, something alive, and it wanted us back inside. "No," Elena said sharply, taking a step back. Her flashlight beam wavered, the light cutting through the rain like a desperate plea. "We can't go back in there. We barely made it out the first time." Her words echoed in my head, but they felt distant, disconnected, like they were coming from someone else. The light from the tower pulsed again, brighter this time, and I felt it deep in my chest, in my bones. It wasn't just light. It was a pull, an invisible thread winding tighter around me, dragging me closer. Mark didn't argue. He started walking toward the lighthouse, his steps slow and deliberate, the journal clutched tightly in his hands. Dylan hesitated for only a moment before following, his head down, his shoulders hunched against the storm. I looked at Elena, her wide eyes filled with fear, her body trembling, and I knew she felt it too. The pull, the inevitability. We didn't speak as we crossed the barren ground, our footsteps muffled by the relentless rain. The door to the lighthouse creaked open as we approached, the sound low and mournful, like a sigh of relief. The air inside was colder than before, sharp and metallic, carrying the faint scent of salt and decay. The shadows were waiting for us. I could feel them pressing against the edges of my vision, shifting and writhing just beyond the reach of the light. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the floor, through my body, a constant reminder of the thing that had drawn us here. The staircase spiraled upward into darkness, the weak beams of our flashlights barely illuminating the steps. We climbed in silence, our breaths loud and uneven. The creak of the stairs beneath our weight, the only sound. The lantern room was different this time. Everything gave. Oh, this time. The walls were darker, the cracks deeper, the glass panes streaked with something that looked like rain, but wasn't. The light wasn't steady anymore. It pulsed erratically, flickering and dimming, casting jagged shadows across the room. And a journal. Mark had opened it again, its pages glowing faintly in the unsteady light. "It's changing," he said, his voice tight. He held the journal out to us, his hands shaking. "Ewa betaters." The words on the page weren't the same. They twisted and blurred, the ink running like blood, forming new phrases, new warnings. The light. It's not enough. It needs more. I didn't understand what he meant. I didn't want to understand. The shadows on the walls were moving again, their forms flickering and stretching, growing taller, darker, more defined. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were shapes, figures, and they were watching us. One of them stepped forward. It moved slowly, deliberately, its body flickering like a flame caught in the wind. It had no face, no features, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The light flared, brighter than before, and the figure stopped, its form twisting and writhing as if in pain. But it didn't retreat. It waited, its head tilted slightly, as if listening. Mark dropped the journal. It hit the floor with a hollow thud, the glowing pages dimming as the shadows closed in. The light pulsed again, a desperate flicker, and I felt it. A weight, a pull, a command. It wanted something. It wanted us. And then the door slammed shut. The sound of the door slamming reverberated through the lighthouse. A deep, resonant echo that seemed to shake the walls themselves. The shadows surged in response, their forms flickering and twisting, pressing closer to the edges of the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I spun toward the door, my flashlight beam trembling across its rusted surface. There was no handle, no latch, nothing that suggested it could have moved on its own. And yet, it had. We were trapped. Mark stood frozen, the journal still at his feet, its faint glow pulsing weakly. Dylan was near the window, his flashlight cutting arcs through the lantern room, the light bouncing off the fractured glass and casting distorted patterns across the floor. Elena was huddled near the staircase, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her face pale and streaked with sweat. None of us spoke. None of us dared to. The light in the room flickered, dimming briefly before flaring again, casting harsh shadows that seemed to move independently of the walls. The hum that had followed us since the first step inside the lighthouse was louder now, sharper, vibrating through the air like the warning growl of some unseen predator. My stomach churned, a visceral reaction to the wrongness that surrounded us, that seeped into our skin, into our minds. And then the whispers started. They weren't loud at first, just a faint murmur at the edge of my hearing, like distant voices carried on a cold wind. But they grew quickly, overlapping and colliding, a chaotic chorus that filled the room with sound. It wasn't just noise. It was something deeper, something that crawled under my skin, threading through my thoughts, twisting them into shapes I didn't recognize. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing. The whispers weren't coming from the air. They were inside me, inside all of us. I could see it in the others, the way their faces twisted in pain, their movements erratic, their eyes darting to places where nothing should be. Dylan dropped his flashlight, the beam spinning wildly across the room, and I saw it. A figure. It was taller than the others we had seen, its form more solid, more defined. Its limbs were long and angular, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth, but I felt its gaze settle on me, heavy and unrelenting. The whispers surged in response, their tone shifting, growing sharper, more insistent. It stepped closer. The light in the room flared again, brighter this time, casting a searing glow that forced me to shield my eyes. The figure hesitated, its form flickering like a flame caught in a gust of wind. But it didn't retreat. It stood there, just beyond the edge of the light, waiting, watching. Elena screamed. The sound snapped through the room like a whip, raw and guttural, filled with a terror that made my blood run cold. She was on the ground now, her hands clawing at her head, her body convulsing as if something was tearing her apart from the inside. Dylan moved toward her, his steps frantic, but the figure shifted, its head tilting sharply in his direction. He froze mid-step, his eyes wide, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Mark grabbed the journal from the floor, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. The glow from the book was stronger now, the words shifting and writhing across the paper like living things. He started, his voice breaking, but the rest of his words were drowned out by the whispers. I moved closer to him, my body trembling, every instinct screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something. The journal's light flared, illuminating a single word etched across the page in dark, jagged letters. Sacrifice. I staggered back, the word burning itself into my mind, the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical force. The whispers grew louder, their meaning clear now, their demands undeniable. They weren't asking, "Will you provide soups together? And can I be burning?" They were taking. The figure moved again, stepping closer to the edge of the light. Its form was clearer now, more human, but not. Its limbs were too long, its proportions off, its movements jerky and unnatural. The light flared brighter, pushing it back slightly, but it didn't stop. It was testing the boundaries, waiting for the moment when the light would fail. Mark turned to me, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and understanding. "It's the only way," he said, his voice barely audible over the whispers. "It wants one of us. If we don't..." The figure lunged. It moved faster than I thought possible, its form blurring as it crossed the distance between us in an instant. The light flared in response, a brilliant, searing burst that filled the room, forcing the shadows back. The figure recoiled, its limbs twisting unnaturally, its form flickering like a dying flame, but it didn't disappear. It didn't leave. The light dimmed again, weaker this time, and the whispers surged, louder, more demanding. I felt the weight of the lighthouse pressing down on me, its presence overwhelming, its intentions clear. It wasn't just a building. It was alive, and it was hungry. Dylan grabbed Elena, pulling her to her feet, his movements frantic. "We have to do something," he shouted, his voice breaking. "We can't just..." The figure lunged again, and this time the light didn't stop it. It reached for Dylan, its long, jagged limbs stretching impossibly far, its form flickering and twisting as it moved. He screamed, his flashlight falling to the floor, the beam spinning wildly as the shadows consumed him. And then he was gone. The room was silent for a moment, the whispers faltering, the shadows retreating slightly, as if satisfied. The light in the room pulsed weakly, its glow unsteady, flickering like a candle on the verge of being snuffed out. Mark stood frozen, the journal still clutched in his hands, his face pale and streaked with tears. Elena was shaking, her breaths shallow and uneven, her eyes wide with terror. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. The whispers were quieter now, but their meaning was still clear, still undeniable. The lighthouse wasn't done with us. Not yet. And as the light dimmed again, the door to the staircase creaked open, revealing the darkness below. The door to the staircase gaped open like a maw, the darkness inside impossibly tense. The whispers returned, faint and insidious, threading through the silence like smoke. My flashlight was trembling in my hand, the beam jittering as it cut through the gloom. Elena was frozen, her back pressed against the wall, her eyes locked on the doorway. Mark stood beside her, clutching the journal so tightly that his knuckles were white. The light in the room flickered again, its glow growing weaker, and the oppressive weight of the lighthouse seemed to double. It wasn't just the air. It was the walls, the floor, the very foundation pressing down on us, urging us forward into the dark. "We can't stay here," Mark said finally, his voice hoarse. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the journal. The glow from its pages had dimmed, but the words were still shifting, twisting into shapes that made my head throb when I tried to read them. "No," Elena whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not going down there. I'm not..." A loud crack interrupted her, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the room. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the space. and my stomach dropped. The shadows on the walls were moving again, their forms sharper, more defined. They weren't just circling us now. They were closing in. I grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her toward the staircase. We don't have a choice. Enable. Egregos. Ah. Shale. She resisted for a moment, her body trembling, but then she relented, her movements jerky and reluctant. Mark was already moving, his steps hesitant as he descended into the darkness. The whispers grew louder as we followed, their chaotic voices pressing against my thoughts, filling my head with half-formed words and fragmented images. The air grew colder with every step, sharper, like needles against my skin. The staircase spiraled downward, the space narrowing, the walls slick with moisture. My flashlight beam barely reached a few feet ahead, the darkness devouring it like a living thing. The sound of our footsteps echoed faintly, each creak of the wood a reminder of how precarious the structure was. The air was damp, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. Where does this even lead? Elena's voice was barely audible, a trembling whisper that seemed to hang in the air before being swallowed by the whispers. I don't think it's supposed to lead anywhere, Mark said, his voice tight. He glanced back at me, the journal still glowing faintly in his hands. I think it's trying to show us something. I didn't respond. Ilay, and through. The staircase felt endless, the steps blending together into a monotonous blur. The whispers were louder now, their tone shifting, growing more urgent. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were emotions, fear, anger, desperation, all crashing together in a torrent that made my head throb and my chest tighten. Finally, the staircase ended, spilling us into another chamber. It was smaller than the lantern room, the walls close and suffocating, the air heavy with dampness. The floor was uneven, patches of stone jutting out like jagged teeth. In the center of the room was another altar, its surface slick and dark, the carvings on it glowing faintly. The light from the altar pulsed in time with the whispers, a rhythmic beat that matched the pounding of my heart. Mark stepped forward, his flashlight beam sweeping across the altar. And the journal in his hands flared briefly, the glow from its pages illuminating the carvings. They were different this time, sharper, more violent, the lines jagged and chaotic. The symbols seemed to twist and writhe under the light, forming patterns that defied comprehension. It's the same as upstairs, he said, his voice barely audible. But worse. Elena stayed near the doorway, her back pressed against the wall, her flashlight clutched tightly in her hands. What does it want? She asked, her voice trembling. Englaneteptibider, a wide, a tide, and poor. Why won't it let us leave? Mark didn't answer. He placed the journal on the altar, the light from its pages spilling across the room, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The whispers surged, louder and more chaotic, their voices blending into a deafening roar. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside me, vibrating through my bones, filling my head with static. And then it stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute, pressing against me with a weight that made it hard to breathe. The altar's glow dimmed, the light from the journal flickering weakly. The shadows on the walls froze, their forms still and unyielding, like they were waiting. A new sound broke the silence, a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from beneath us. The floor trembled, cracks spreading outward from the altar, and the air grew colder, sharper. The rumble grew louder, deeper, until it was all I could hear. A sound that vibrated through the room, through my chest, through my thoughts. The cracks in the floor widened, revealing a void beneath us, a swirling, churning darkness that seemed to pull at the edges of the light. The whispers returned, softer now, but more insistent, their meaning clear and undeniable. Sacrifice. The word echoed in my head, cutting through the chaos, through the fear. It wasn't a demand. It was a certainty, a truth that had been written into the foundation of the lighthouse, into the very air we breathe. The altar pulsed in response, its light growing brighter, sharper, as if it was feeding off the realization of our fear. Mark stepped back, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and understanding. "It's us," he said, his voice trembling. "It's always been us." The shadows began to move again, their forms flickering and twisting, coalescing into shapes that were almost human. Almost. They stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate, their hollow gazes fixed on us with a hunger that made my skin crawl. And deep in the void beneath the altar, something stirred. The ground beneath us trembled, a low, guttural vibration that crawled through my feet and into my chest. The cracks surrounding the altar widened, the jagged lines glowing faintly, as if the earth itself were bleeding light. The void below churned, its surface shifting and rippling like liquid shadow. And from its depths came a sound, a deep, resonant hum that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The whispers were relentless now, swirling around me, filling my head with a chaotic cacophony of voices that clashed and overlapped, their meaning both incomprehensible and undeniable. My heart pounded, every beat a desperate attempt to drown them out, to hold on to what little clarity I had left. But the lighthouse wouldn't let me go. Its presence pressed down on me, a weight so crushing that I could barely stand. Mark was still by the altar, his face pale, his eyes locked on the void. The journal lay open in front of him, its pages glowing faintly, the ink writhing like worms. Elena was frozen near the wall, her flashlight clutched to her chest, her breaths shallow and uneven. Her wide, tear-filled eyes darted between the shadows, creeping along the walls, and the dark, shifting mass below. And then the shadows moved. They didn't lunge, didn't rush toward us like before. They were deliberate, methodical, their forms flickering and shifting as they coalesced into something almost human. almost oh, misty. Their bodies were impossibly tall, their limbs too long, their movements jerky, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. They circled us, their hollow faces turned toward the altar, toward the void, toward me. The whispers in my head grew sharper, their tone more insistent. I couldn't understand the words, but the message was clear. It wanted me to act, to choose. My gaze fell to the altar, to the journal resting on its surface, its pages still glowing with that faint, sickly light. The shadows stopped. The air grew colder, so sharp it hurt to breathe. The void beneath the altar churned violently, its rippling surface rising, expanding, as if something immense was pressing against it from below, trying to break through. And then I saw it. A shape, impossibly large, impossibly dark, moving within the void. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just a figure. It was everything. The hum in the room deepened, resonating through the air, through the stone, through my chest. The light from the altar flickered, its glow growing weaker, dimmer, and I felt the shadows pressing closer, their presence suffocating. The whispers surged again, their voices overlapping in a chaotic, frenzied roar. Mark turned to me, his eyes wide with terror, and something else, something like resolve. "It's the only way," he said, his voice trembling. He reached for the journal, his hands shaking, his movements slow and deliberate. I didn't know what he was planning to do. I didn't know if he even knew. But I felt it, the lighthouse shifting around us, the shadows tightening their circle, the void below rising higher, closer. The air crackled with energy, charged and volatile, and I knew we were running out of time. "Stop." Elena's voice cracked, a raw, desperate sound that barely broke through the noise. She lunged forward, grabbing Mark's arm, pulling him away from the altar. "You don't know what it wants." Mark pulled free, his movements frantic, his breaths ragged. "It doesn't matter," he shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. "If we don't do something, it's going to take all of us." The light from the altar flared suddenly, brighter than before, a blinding, searing brightness that forced me to shield my eyes. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering and distorting, but they didn't retreat. They held their ground, their hollow faces turned toward the altar, waiting. And then Mark stepped forward. And the journal in his hands pulsed, its light growing brighter, more erratic, as if it were alive. He placed it back on the altar, the glow spilling across the surface, illuminating the jagged carvings that seemed to writhe and twist in response. The void below rippled violently, its surface breaking apart, and the shape within rose higher, closer, its presence overwhelming. Mark turned to us, his face pale, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. "I'll do it," he said, his voice trembling. "It has to be me." "No." Elena's scream tore through the room, raw and guttural. But Mark didn't stop. He stepped onto the cracks surrounding the altar, his movements slow, and deliberate, his eyes locked on the void. The light from the altar flared again, brighter, sharper, and the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. The shadows moved. They surged toward Mark, their forms twisting and stretching, their hollow faces fixed on him. With a hunger that made my stomach churn, the light from the altar pulsed violently, pushing them back. But they didn't stop. They pressed closer, their movements frenzied, their forms blurring as they reached for him. And then Mark was gone. The light from the altar died, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers stopped. The void below stilled, and the shadows froze, their forms dissolving into the walls, into the cracks, into nothing. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy and suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on me like a vice. Elena collapsed to her knees, her sobs breaking the silence, her flashlight slipping from her hands and clattering to the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. My gaze was fixed on the altar, on the empty space where Mark had stood, on the faint glow of the journal, still resting on its surface, and in the distance, faint but unmistakable, I heard it. The light above us flickered back to life, casting long, distorted shadows across the chamber, and the whispers returned, softer now, almost gentle. It's not over. The end. The silence didn't last long. Envidel, shivers. It shattered with the first pulse of light from the altar, faint and uneven, casting jagged shadows across the chamber. The journal still lay there, its glow dim, its pages still and lifeless, now that Mark was gone. My heart pounded in the oppressive stillness, every beat a desperate attempt to fill the void he'd left behind. Elena's sobs cut through the air, raw and guttural, but they were drowned out by the returning hum, low and resonant, vibrating through the floor, the walls, my very bones. The void below stirred again, its surface rippling faintly, and the whispers crept back into my mind, soft at first, but growing, spreading, filling every corner of my thoughts. They didn't feel chaotic anymore. They were calm, patient. They had won. I reached for Elena, my hand trembling as I pulled her to her feet. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide and unfocused. She was murmuring something under her breath. Words I couldn't make out, couldn't understand. The light from the altar pulsed weakly, and the shadows around us seemed to shift, inching closer, waiting. Elena, I whispered, my voice breaking. We need to move. We can't stay here. She didn't respond at first, her gaze locked on the empty space where Mark had stood. Then, slowly, she nodded, her body trembling as she took a shaky step forward. My flashlight beam wavered as I turned toward the staircase, the darkness beyond it pressing against the edges of the light like a living thing. But before we could move, the whispers changed. They grew sharper, more insistent, their tone urgent, and the hum in the room deepened, rising in pitch, in intensity. The cracks around the altar widened, glowing faintly, and the void below churned violently. The shape within it rose higher, its edges clearer now, its presence overwhelming. It wasn't just in the room. It was the room, the lighthouse, the storm outside. It was everything. The light from the altar flared suddenly, a blinding, searing brightness that forced me to shield my eyes. Elena screamed, a raw, desperate sound, and I felt her hand clutch mine, her grip tight and trembling. The brightness faded as quickly as it had come, and when I lowered my arm, I saw it. A figure. It was rising from the void. Its form massive and indistinct, shifting like smoke caught in a gale. Its limbs were too long, its proportions impossibly wrong. And its face, or where its face should have been, was a hollow void, endless and consuming. It moved with deliberate slowness, its presence radiating a suffocating weight that pressed down on me, stealing the air from my lungs. The whispers surged again, louder now, crashing together in a cacophony that made my head throb. The figure tilted its head, its hollow gaze fixed on us, and the shadows around it writhed and twisted, forming shapes that were almost human, almost familiar. Elena, I choked out, my voice barely audible over the noise. Run, Pika. She didn't move. The figure reached out, its impossibly long arms stretching toward us, the air around it rippling like heat waves. I grabbed Elena, pulling her back, and she stumbled, her flashlight clattering to the floor. The beam spun wildly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance and twist in response. We ran. The staircase was narrower now, the walls closer, the air colder. The hum followed us, vibrating through the wood, through my chest, through my thoughts. The whispers were relentless, threading through my mind, urging me to stop, to turn back, to give in. Elena was ahead of me, her breaths loud and uneven, her movements frantic. My flashlight flickered, its beam dimming, and the darkness pressed closer, threatening to swallow us whole. When we reached the top, the lantern room was different. The glass walls were cracked, streaked with rain, and the machinery that powered the light was rusted and broken. But the light was still there, blazing with a brilliance that didn't belong, that shouldn't exist. The shadows were everywhere, circling the edges of the room, their forms flickering and shifting, their hollow gazes fixed on us. The whispers quieted, their tone softening, almost coaxing. The light pulsed in time with them, a rhythmic beat that matched the pounding of my heart. I felt it then, the pull, the weight of the lighthouse pressing against me, urging me forward. It wasn't just light, it was a command. Elena collapsed to her knees, her body trembling, her face pale and streaked with sweat. I can't, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I can't do this. End to this. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that it was going to be okay. But the words wouldn't come. I couldn't lie to her. I couldn't lie to myself. Envelop. The lighthouse didn't want comfort. It wanted something else. Something more. Hey, the whispers returned, louder now, sharper, their voices layered and overlapping, forming a single, undeniable word. Choose. Bang. As the light flared, its brightness searing, and the shadows surged forward, their forms coalescing into a single towering shape. It loomed over us, its hollow face tilting downward, its presence suffocating. The whispers grew louder, their tone demanding, and the light pulsed violently, casting jagged shadows that stretched and twisted across the room. I stepped forward. The shadows recoiled slightly, their forms flickering, their movements hesitant. The light brightened, its glow filling the room, pushing back the darkness. The whispers softened, their tone shifting to something almost soothing, almost grateful. I turned to Elena, her wide, tear-filled eyes locked on me, her body trembling. "It's the only way," I said, my voice trembling. "It's the only way to end this." She didn't respond. She didn't have to. The light pulsed again, brighter than before, and the shadows retreated, dissolving into the walls, into the cracks, into nothing. The whispers faded, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the room. And as I stepped into the light, the world went silent. The fire crackled softly, its embers casting fleeting shadows on the trees surrounding us. The towering pines loomed above, their darkened forms stretching endlessly into the night sky, blotting out the stars. The air was damp and cold, heavy with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. A faint breeze whispered through the forest, its sound so subtle it could have been mistaken for breath. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, on the comforting sound of the crackling wood. But there was something about the forest that night, something off. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was tense, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. The others seemed to feel it too. And Nadyanine, Babes Isle, their voices, usually loud and full of jokes, had quieted, replaced by half-hearted murmurs and nervous glances into the darkness beyond the circle of light. I glanced at my watch. It was later than I thought. The firelight flickered across the face of the dial, making it hard to read. Midnight, maybe later. Time had started to lose its meaning in this place. Came out to call. The deeper we went into the forest, the more disconnected everything felt. Like we were slipping out of the world we knew and into something else, something older. Then I heard it. At first, it was so faint I thought it was my imagination. A soft, almost imperceptible sound drifting through the trees. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. A whisper. I froze, straining to listen. But the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. My heart pounded in my chest, a heavy, uneven rhythm that echoed in my ears. The fire crackled again, louder this time, startling me. I glanced at the others. They hadn't noticed, or if they had, they weren't saying anything. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, just the sound of the forest settling. But deep down, I knew better. The whisper came again, clearer now, threading through the stillness like smoke. It wasn't a word, not exactly, but it had weight, intention. It seemed to wrap around me, pulling me toward the edge of the camp, toward the darkness. My body felt heavy, my movements sluggish, as though I were caught in a current I couldn't see. I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me, and stepped away from the fire. The others barely reacted, too absorbed in their own unease to notice mine. The whisper grew louder as I moved closer to the trees, its tone soft but insistent. It wasn't random. It was calling me. The darkness beyond the firelight was absolute, swallowing everything in its path. My flashlight beam cut through it weakly, illuminating only the nearest trunks. The air was colder here, sharper, and the ground beneath my boots felt damp, like the forest itself was alive and breathing. I stopped just beyond the edge of the camp, my breath visible in the cold night air. The whisper had stopped again, leaving me in a silence so deep it felt oppressive. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming briefly before steadying, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, a flicker of motion just beyond the edge of the light. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. And nothing. Just the wind, or what I told myself was the wind. I turned to head back to the fire, to the safety of the others. But as I did, the whisper returned, louder this time, closer. It wasn't behind me anymore. It was in front of me, deeper in the trees. Moi. I stepped closer, the flashlight beam trembling in my unsteady hand. The trees seemed to grow closer together as I moved, their branches forming a tangled canopy that blocked out even the faint glow of the moon. The whisper grew louder still, its tone shifting, becoming more distinct, more human. My foot caught on something, and I stumbled, catching myself against a tree. My flashlight fell, the beam spinning wildly before settling on the ground. When I reached to pick it up, my hand froze. There, in the dirt, was a footprint. It wasn't fresh. The edges had softened, and the rain from earlier had washed parts of it away, but it was unmistakably human. End of story. Human, and it was heading deeper into the forest. I should have turned back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run, to forget I had ever seen it. But the whisper was insistent now, pulling me forward, compelling me to follow. My hand tightened around the flashlight, and I stepped over the footprint, deeper into the trees. The forest was different here. The air was heavier, the silence thicker, and the shadows seemed to move just at the edge of my vision. The trees themselves felt alive, their branches stretching toward me like grasping fingers. The whisper was constant now, threading through my thoughts, filling my head with its soft, insistent pull. And then I saw it. Just ahead, barely visible in the weak light, was a shape. It was hunched over, its form indistinct, blending into the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I raised the flashlight, the beam trembling as it landed on the figure. It wasn't human. Not anymore. Lee. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. It turned toward me, its hollow eyes catching the light, and I felt a cold so deep it seemed to freeze my thoughts, my breath, my very soul. The whisper stopped. For a moment, the forest was silent, the weight of it pressing down on me like a vice. And then the figure moved, its limbs unfolding, its hollow face tilting toward me. It didn't run. It didn't lunge. It simply stepped forward, slow and deliberate, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. I stumbled back, the flashlight beam shaking wildly, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The figure stopped just short of the light, its form flickering, shifting, like it wasn't entirely real. And then it spoke. Its voice was low, resonant, vibrating through the air like a distant echo. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command. Stay. The root. Bill. Devil. Gaon Koga. Today. And it vanished, dissolving into the shadows, as if it had never been there. The forest around me came alive with sound, branches creaking, leaves rustling, the faint murmur of voices threading through the trees. I turned and ran, my footsteps loud and frantic, the whisper chasing me every step of the way. The sound of my frantic footsteps was swallowed by the forest, the ground beneath me, soft and damp, muffling every desperate step. My flashlight beam swung wildly, barely illuminating the narrow path ahead, its weak glow flickering as if it too was struggling to hold on. The air grew colder the farther I ran, sharp and biting, carrying a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The whispering hadn't stopped. It was everywhere now, surrounding me, weaving through the trees like a living thing. It wasn't words anymore. It was a presence, something vast and unseen pressing against my thoughts, coiling around my mind, pulling me deeper into the forest. No matter how hard I tried to escape, the firelight from the camp was nowhere to be seen. I had lost my bearings, the world reduced to shadows and whispers, and the unrelenting cold. The trees seemed closer now, their gnarled branches stretching toward me like skeletal hands. My chest burned with each breath, my legs screaming for rest. But I couldn't stop. Not when the thing I had seen was still out there, waiting. A branch snapped behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, the sound reverberating through the silence like a gunshot. The whispers quieted, pulling back just enough for the stillness to settle in, thick and oppressive. I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The trees stood silent and still, their forms shifting slightly in the weak light, their shadows long and distorted. But I felt it. That heavy, suffocating presence, watching me, waiting just beyond the edge of the light. My heart pounded, the sound of it echoing in my ears, and I forced myself to take a step back, then another. The flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering weakly, before plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me, cold and overwhelming, as I fumbled with the flashlight, slapping it against my palm. The whispers surged again, louder this time, more insistent, threading through the air with a frantic urgency that made my skin crawl. The light returned. It was weaker now, barely more than a flicker, but it was enough to see the figure standing just a few feet away. It wasn't moving. It stood motionless among the trees, its hollow eyes fixed on me, its form flickering and shifting like a mirage. My mind screamed at me to run, to do anything, but my body refused to move. I could only stand there, frozen in place, as the figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying me. It raised one long, spindly arm, pointing deeper into the forest. "Go," it said, its voice low and resonant, vibrating through the air like the toll of a distant bell. The word sent a chill through me, sharp and visceral, breaking through the paralysis that held me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, my movements frantic and uncoordinated. The figure didn't follow. He would be base. He will up. It stood there, watching, its arm still outstretched, its presence radiating an unnatural stillness that was somehow worse than if it had chased me. I turned and ran, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. The forest around me seemed to shift and twist, the trees growing closer together, their branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy that blocked out what little moonlight there was. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The path suddenly opened up, spilling me into a clearing. I skidded to a stop, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my flashlight sweeping across the space. It was small, surrounded by a dense wall of trees that seemed to press in on all sides. At the center of the clearing was something that didn't belong, a house. It was small and weathered, its wooden exterior warped and blackened, as if it had been scorched by fire. The windows were dark, their glass cracked and covered in grime, and the door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently in the faint breeze. The sight of it sent a wave of unease through me, stronger than anything I had felt so far. It was wrong, out of place, like it had been plucked from another time and dropped here, forgotten and decaying. The whispers quieted again, their chaotic voices fading into a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. I didn't want to go near the house. Any peace, Clive. I didn't want to go near the house. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, to run, to leave this place behind. But the pull was stronger. The same force that had drawn me into the forest now guided me toward the door, compelling me to step closer, despite the rising panic in my chest. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I crossed the threshold, the sound loud and jarring in the stillness. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic. My flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating a sparse interior, bare walls, a single table covered in dust, and a chair that sat askew as if someone had left in a hurry. But it wasn't empty. At the far end of the room, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure. It was slumped against the wall, its head bowed, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. My heart thundered in my chest as I stepped closer, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. The figure didn't move. It didn't breathe. It was human, or it had been. Its skin was pale and waxy, stretched too tightly over its bones, and its eyes were gone, replaced by empty sockets that seemed to stare back at me. Something was carved into its chest, deep, jagged lines that formed a symbol I didn't recognize. The whispers grew louder again, their voices frantic, overlapping, urging me to look closer. And then the figure moved. Its head jerked up, its hollow gaze locking onto mine, and I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The light flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room as the figure slowly, impossibly, began to stand. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty house, the whispers chasing me with every step. I burst out into the clearing, the cold night air biting against my skin, and I didn't stop. The forest swallowed me again, its darkness deeper now, more alive. And the whispers were everywhere, louder than ever, pulling me deeper, pulling me towards something I couldn't see but could feel, something that was waiting for me. The forest swallowed me whole. The deeper I ran, the darker it became, the trees tightening their grasp like a cage. My flashlight flickered weakly, struggling against the oppressive blackness that pressed in from all sides. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, threading through my thoughts like tendrils of smoke. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were voices, overlapping and clashing, their words just out of reach, teasing the edges of understanding. My breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale a struggle against the suffocating cold that wrapped around me like a second skin. My legs burned, but I couldn't stop, not with the memory of that thing in the house burned into my mind. Its hollow sockets, its jerky, unnatural movements, the way it had stood, as if something had yanked it upright. I could still feel its gaze, heavy and consuming, even though I'd fled. I stumbled over a root, my flashlight clattering to the ground, its beam spinning wildly before going dark. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to pick it up, my trembling hands struggling to find the switch. When the light returned, it illuminated something I hadn't noticed before. A path. It was faint, barely visible beneath the undergrowth, but it was there, winding its way deeper into the forest. The whispers shifted, their tone softening, coaxing. They wanted me to follow it. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to find the others, to get as far away from this place as possible. But the pull was stronger, tugging at something deep inside me, something I couldn't ignore. The path was uneven, littered with stones and roots that snagged at my boots. The air grew colder as I walked, sharper, each breath burning my throat. The trees on either side seemed to press closer, their branches intertwining above me to form a canopy that blocked out the sky. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, its beam trembling as if it too were afraid. The path led to a clearing. I stopped at its edge, my heart pounding as I took in the scene before me. The clearing was small, enclosed by a dense wall of trees that seemed to lean inward, their gnarled branches forming an almost impenetrable barrier. At its center was a circle of stones, weathered and moss-covered, surrounding a single object that stood out starkly against the muted greens and browns of the forest. It was a tree, but not like the others. It was massive, its trunk blackened and twisted, its bark etched with strange, jagged symbols that glowed faintly in the weak light of my flashlight. The branches stretched outward like skeletal arms, their tips sharp and claw-like, and at the base of the tree, nestled among its roots, was something that made my stomach churn. A figure. It was slumped against the trunk, its body pale and still, its head bowed. The symbols carved into the bark seemed to extend onto its skin, the lines jagged and deep, like they had been burned into its flesh. My hands tightened around the flashlight, the beam shaking as I stepped closer. The whispers surged again, their voices overlapping, frantic, urging me forward. The figure moved. It was subtle at first, a twitch of the fingers, a slight tilt of the head, but it was enough to send a cold wave of terror through me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as the figure slowly raised its head. Its eyes, or what was left of them, met mine, empty sockets that seemed to pull at the edges of my vision, drawing me in. Its mouth moved, the words barely audible, but I heard them as clearly as if they had been shouted. "Help me." The voice was broken, hoarse, like it hadn't been used in years. I stepped back, my flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated more of the figure's face. Its skin was stretched too tightly over its bones, its features distorted and unnatural. The whispers grew louder, their tones shifting, pleading, desperate. I wanted to run, to turn and flee back into the forest, but my body wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, the pull stronger than ever, compelling me to step closer. The figure's head tilted slightly, its empty gaze fixed on me, and it spoke again, its voice trembling. "Don't let it take me." The words sent a chill through me, sharp and visceral. The whispers surged again, louder, more urgent, drowning out everything else. The figure reached for me, its movements slow and jerky, and I stumbled back, my flashlight beam catching on the twisted symbols carved into the tree. They were glowing brighter now, their light pulsing in time with the whispers. with the frantic pounding of my heart. And then the ground began to shake. It was subtle at first, a faint vibration beneath my feet, but it grew quickly, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The whispers turned to screams, a deafening cacophony that filled the clearing, and the figure slumped against the tree, let out a raw, guttural cry, its body convulsing violently. The tree moved. Its branches stretched upward, their claw-like tips scraping against the darkened sky, and its trunk twisted, the symbols carved into its bark glowing brighter, sharp. The air grew colder, the metallic tang stronger, and I felt a pressure in my chest, an invisible weight pressing down on me, stealing the air from my lungs. The figure screamed again, its voice a desperate, inhuman wail that sent a wave of nausea through me. Its body convulsed one last time before going still, its head lolling forward, its hollow eyes fixed on the ground. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the clearing, through my chest, through my mind. The tree stilled, its branches returning to their twisted, skeletal state, and the glow from the symbols began to fade. The air grew quieter, the oppressive weight lifting slightly, but the unease remained, lingering in the back of my mind like a shadow. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my flashlight beam flickering weakly. The whispers hadn't disappeared. They were still there, threading through the air, softer now, but no less insistent. They were pulling me again, guiding me back toward the forest, toward the darkness, toward whatever was waiting, and I couldn't stop myself from following. The whispers were softer now, almost gentle, as if coaxing me forward. The clearing and its monstrous tree faded behind me, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. My footsteps were hesitant, uneven, the ground beneath me shifting between damp soil and tangled roots. Every movement felt heavier, as though the air itself had thickened, wrapping around me like a shroud. I didn't know where I was going, but it didn't matter. The forest had taken control, its unseen hand guiding my every step. My flashlight's beam flickered again, weak and unreliable, barely illuminating the narrow path ahead. The trees loomed closer, their twisted branches reaching down as if to touch me, their bark etched with those same jagged symbols that pulsed faintly in the darkness. Ahead, a faint light flickered. At first, I thought it was my flashlight reflecting off the trees, but the glow was different, warmer, more alive. I moved closer, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder with every step, their chaotic voices threading through my mind, filling my thoughts with fragments of words I couldn't understand. The light led me to another clearing, smaller than the last, but no less unsettling. At its center was a small cabin, its weathered wood glowing faintly in the warm light emanating from within. The windows were cracked and dark, the door slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. It shouldn't have been there. It didn't belong. Meanwhile, I stepped closer, the whispers pressing against my thoughts. their tone shifting to something more urgent, more insistent. The air in the cabin was colder, sharper, and the metallic tang from before was stronger here, making my stomach chirp. My flashlight flickered again, the beam dimming as if the light from the cabin was draining its strength. The door creaked open as I approached, revealing a narrow entryway that was shrouded in shadows. The warm light from inside spilled out in uneven waves, flickering like a dying flame. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave this place behind. But the pull was stronger. The forest wouldn't let me leave. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside, the sound loud and jarring in the otherwise silent space. The air was thick with dampness and decay, and the faint light did little to illuminate the room. My flashlight beams swept across the walls, revealing shelves lined with jars, filled with dark, unidentifiable substances. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending together into a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the air. At the far end of the room was a table, its surface covered in scattered papers and an assortment of strange objects. My flashlight landed on a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn, its edges darkened with what looked like old blood. The whispers surged as I reached for it, their tone frantic, almost pleading. My fingers brushed the cover, and a chill shot through me, sharp and visceral, making my hand tremble. The journal was heavy, its pages thick and yellowed, filled with cramped handwriting that seemed to twist and shift as I read. The words were disjointed, fragmented, but they painted a picture of something ancient, something hungry. The forest wasn't just alive. It was aware. It had been here long before the first settlers arrived, long before anyone dared to carve paths through its depths, and it demanded sacrifices. The last entry was different. The handwriting was jagged, frantic, the ink smudged as though it had been written in a panic. The words were etched into my mind as I read them, their meaning sinking deep into my thoughts. The forest takes what it is owed. The whispers are not a warning. They are a promise. The sound of something shifting behind me snapped me out of my trance. I spun around, my flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the darkness. The door was closed now, the warm light gone, leaving the room bathed in a cold, suffocating darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped back, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. The whispers were everywhere, louder now, their voices filling the room, pressing against my thoughts with an almost physical force. The shadows moved at the edges of the light, their forms flickering and shifting too fast to fully see. My heart pounded, the sound of it echoing in my ears as I stumbled toward the door, my movements frantic and unsteady. It wouldn't budge. The whispers grew deafening, their chaotic voices crashing together into a single, unrelenting scream. The room began to shake, the shelves rattling, the jars toppling and shattering on the floor, their contents spilling out in dark, viscous pools. The air was thick with the stench of decay, sharp and overwhelming, making my stomach heave. The shadows surged forward, They weren't just shadows anymore. They were figures, tall and distorted, their forms flickering and shifting like flames caught in the wind. They moved toward me with deliberate slowness, their hollow gazes fixed on me, their presence suffocating. I backed away, my flashlight beam shaking as it illuminated their twisted forms. I backed away, and then they stopped. The whispers fell silent, leaving a heavy, oppressive stillness in their wake. The shadows stood motionless, their hollow faces turned toward me, their movements frozen. The journal in my hands grew warm, its leather cover pulsing faintly, and I felt the weight of the forest pressing down on me, urging me to open it again. I flipped to the last page. The words were different now, etched into the paper in jagged, blood-red lines. They weren't a warning or a promise. They were a command. Offer yourself. Offer yourself. The shadows moved again, faster this time, their forms blurring as they closed the distance between us. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The last thing I saw before the light disappeared completely was the journal, its pages glowing faintly, the words burning into my mind. And then the whispers returned. The darkness was alive. It wrapped around me, pressing against my skin, seeping into my thoughts like an invasive force. My flashlight was useless now, the beam long dead, leaving me stranded in a void where the air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. The whispers were everywhere, threading through the silence, rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. I clutched the journal tightly to my chest, its warmth radiating through the leather cover, an eerie contrast to the icy cold of the room. The symbols etched into its pages seemed to glow faintly, their light pulsing in time with the whispers, with the frantic pounding of my heart. I couldn't see the shadows anymore, but I could feel them pressing closer, their presence suffocating, their hollow gazes fixed on me. The door was still locked, the handle unyielding under my trembling hands. I turned back toward the center of the room, my eyes straining against the darkness. The faint glow of the journal illuminated the table, the scattered papers, the shattered jars spilling their strange, viscous contents across the floor. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the air heavier with every passing moment. The whispers changed. They grew louder, more insistent, their tone shifting from chaotic to commanding. They weren't just in the air anymore. They were in me, threading through my thoughts, pulling at the edges of my mind. I could feel their meaning now, not in words, but in emotions, desperation, hunger, anger. They weren't asking. They were demanding. The journal in my hands flared suddenly, its light blinding, and I stumbled back, my vision swimming as shapes began to form in the glow. They weren't clear, just outlines, flickering and unstable, shifting like smoke caught in an invisible wind. But they were there, and they were watching. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, low and resonant, vibrating through the room. through my chest, through the very air. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could understand, but its meaning was clear. And choose it. The journal grew heavier in my hands, its warmth intensifying until it burned against my skin. I dropped it instinctively, the leather cover hitting the floor with a dull thud. The glow from its pages spilled across the room, illuminating the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The symbols etched into the wood pulsed in response, their jagged lines glowing faintly, their shapes shifting and twisting like living things. The air grew colder, sharper, cutting through my skin like needles. The whispers rose again, their voices clashing and overlapping, filling the room with a cacophony that made my head throb and my chest tighten. The shadows moved closer, their forms flickering at the edges of the light, their hollow gazes fixed on me. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the floor, my body frozen in place as the shadows circled me, their movements slow and deliberate. The whispers were in my head now, threading through my thoughts, weaving a web of fear and despair that I couldn't escape. The journal pulsed again, its light dimming and brightening in time with the whispers, with the shadows, with the thing that I knew was waiting just beyond the edge of the light. The voice returned, louder this time, more insistent. Choose, pending. And my gaze fell to the journal, its pages glowing faintly, the words etched into them twisting and shifting, forming shapes that I couldn't understand but somehow knew. It wasn't just a book. It was a key, a door, a tether to whatever ancient force had claimed this forest as its own. And it wanted something from me, something I wasn't sure I could give. The ground beneath me trembled, a low, resonant vibration that rose from the earth itself. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, their chaotic voices clashing and colliding, filling the room with a sound that was both overwhelming and hollow. The walls seemed to shift, the symbols etched into them writhing and twisting, their light growing brighter, sharper. The shadows surged forward. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps, my hands clutching at the doorframe for support. The shadows didn't stop. They moved closer, their forms more defined now, tall and distorted, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. They weren't human. They couldn't be. But there was something about them, something familiar that I couldn't place. And then I saw it. One of the shadows stepped into the light, its form flickering and unstable, but its features unmistakable. It was me, or a twisted, hollow version of me. Its empty gaze locked onto mine, its face contorted into a grotesque mockery of my own. It raised a hand, its movements slow and deliberate, and pointed to the journal lying on the floor. The voice returned, softer now, almost gentle. Choose, pace, holds. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't want to. You went off. Again, but I could feel the weight of its command, the pull of the journal, the hunger of the forest pressing against me from all sides. The whispers softened, their tone shifting to something almost coaxing, almost kind. They wanted me to believe that this was inevitable, that I had no choice. The shadows moved closer, their forms blurring together, merging into a single towering shape that loomed over me, its presence suffocating. The air grew colder still, the metallic tang sharper, filling my lungs with every desperate breath. The journal flared one last time, its light searing, and I felt the pull, the invisible force dragging me toward it, compelling me to reach for it, to take it, to obey. And as my fingers brushed the leather cover, the whispers fell silent. The silence was absolute, heavy, suffocating. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was a presence, thick and oppressive, pressing down on me like the weight of the forest itself. My fingers brushed the journal, its surface warm and pulsing faintly beneath my touch, as though it were alive. I hesitated, the air around me growing colder, sharper, each breath a struggle against the suffocating stillness. The shadows didn't retreat. They lingered at the edge of the dim light, their forms flickering and shifting, their hollow gazes fixed on me. The towering figure loomed above them, its presence more felt than seen. A vast, consuming darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly into the void. It didn't move. It didn't have to. Its hunger was palpable, radiating through the room like heat from a dying fire. I picked up the journal. The light from its pages flared, blinding and searing, illuminating the room in a harsh, unnatural glow. The symbols carved into the walls pulsed in response, their jagged lines writhing and twisting as though they were alive. The air vibrated with an intensity that made my teeth ache, the silence breaking with a low, resonant hum that rose from the floor, from the walls, from the journal itself. The shadows recoiled slightly, their forms flickering, their movements hesitant. The towering figure shifted, its presence pressing closer, the darkness around it pulsing like a heartbeat. The whispers returned, louder now, their chaotic voices threading through the air, through my thoughts, weaving a web of fear and desperation that I couldn't escape. The journal in my hands grew heavier, its warmth intensifying until it burned against my skin. I opened it, the pages glowing with an otherworldly light, the words etched into them, shifting and twisting, forming shapes that defied comprehension. The meaning wasn't in the words, it was in the feeling, the overwhelming sense of dread that sank deep into my chest, rooting itself there like a parasite. The voice returned, low and resonant, vibrating through my bones. Offer yourself. Ende alfetum sul bacranators engel enda. The words were clear now, undeniable, sinking into my mind like hooks. They weren't a suggestion, they were a command. The whispers surged in response, their chaotic voices clashing and overlapping, filling the room with a cacophony of sound that made my head throb and my chest tighten. tighten. The light from the journal flared again, brighter, sharper, casting jagged shadows across the room. The towering figure moved. It stepped closer, its form flickering and unstable, its hollow gaze fixed on me. The air around it rippled, distorting the light, warping the space between us. It raised a hand, its movements slow and deliberate, and pointed to the journal in my hands. I shook my head, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my fingers tightening around the book. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling, barely audible over the noise. But the forest didn't care. The shadows didn't care. The figure didn't care. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Offer yourself. Andre Estelle." The ground beneath me trembled, a low, resonant vibration that rose from the earth itself. The light from the journal dimmed, its glow flickering weakly, and the shadows pressed closer, their forms merging into a single, writhing mass of darkness that stretched toward me, consuming the space around me. I felt the pull again, stronger now, an invisible force dragging me forward, toward the towering figure, toward the journal, toward whatever ancient force had claimed this forest as its own. My legs moved without my consent, my body obeying the forest's will, my mind screaming in protest. The journal flared one last time, its light searing and blinding, and I felt the pull intensify. The weight of the forest pressing down on me, stealing the air from my lungs, the thoughts from my mind. The voice was everywhere now, threading through the whispers, through the hum, through the light. "You were chosen." The words hit me like a physical blow, sinking into my chest, wrapping around my heart like a vice. The shadows surged forward, their forms blurring together, merging into the towering figure, its hollow gaze consuming me, its presence overwhelming. The light from the journal dimmed, flickering weakly, and I knew, deep down, I knew that I couldn't fight this. The air around me grew colder, sharper, each breath burning in my throat. The ground beneath me shifted, the vibrations intensifying, the whispers growing louder, their voices clashing and colliding, filling the room with a sound that was both overwhelming and hollow. And then everything stopped. The light from the journal died, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers fell silent, the vibrations ceased, and the air grew still. The shadows were gone. The towering figure was gone. The forest was gone. I was alone. Pintfulla. Evil waters and was low. The journal was cold in my hands, its pages blank, its weight no more than a faint memory of what it had been. The room around me was empty, the walls bare, the symbols gone, and the air was warm, soft, carrying the faint scent of moss and earth. For a moment, I thought it was over, and then the whispers returned. The forest swallowed the last traces of sunlight, the shadows stretching like fingers through the underbrush. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Every step we took deeper into the woods felt wrong, like the forest itself was closing in on us, pulling us away from the world we knew. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there, that this place was meant to stay hidden, untouched. The house was the first sign that something was terribly off. It sat at the edge of a clearing, its wooden frame sagging under the weight of time. The windows were black and empty, their glass long gone, and the roof had partially caved in, leaving jagged wooden beams jutting out like broken ribs. Ivy climbed up the walls, choking the wood, as though the forest was trying to reclaim it. It didn't look abandoned. It looked devoured. We stood there for a moment, staring at it in silence. The trees around the clearing were unnaturally still, their branches motionless despite the faint breeze that had followed us into the forest. The quiet was unnerving. No birds, no insects, not even the distant rustle of leaves. Just silence, thick and oppressive. I don't know who stepped forward first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the pull of curiosity, that primal need to understand the things that frighten us. The ground beneath my boots was soft, damp, and every step seemed to sink deeper, like the earth itself was trying to swallow me whole. The others followed reluctantly, their footsteps hesitant, their eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the edges of the clearing. The door to the house hung ajar, creaking faintly as it swayed on rusted hinges. It wasn't the wind. There was no wind. I reached for it, my hand trembling slightly. The air colder the closer I got. The wood was rough under my fingertips, splintered and damp, and the moment I pushed it open, the smell hit me. Rot. It was thick and cloying, a nauseating mixture of damp wood, decay, and something metallic. I gagged, covering my nose and mouth with my sleeve. As I stepped inside, the floorboards groaned under my weight, the sound echoing through the empty space. The light from outside barely penetrated the darkness, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. The interior was sparse, as if whoever had lived there had left in a hurry, or never really lived there at all. A table stood in the center of the room, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. On it were objects I couldn't immediately make sense of. A broken glass jar filled with what looked like dirt, a tattered notebook with its pages warped from moisture, and a small wooden figurine carved in the shape of a person. The figure's face was blank, smooth, featureless, and yet it felt like it was staring at me. I turned toward the others, but they hadn't followed me inside. They stood just beyond the threshold, their faces pale, their expressions tense. One of them, Ben, was staring into the forest, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something. I called his name, but he didn't react. His hand tightened around the strap of his backpack, his knuckles white, and before I could say anything else, he stepped back into the trees. It happened so fast. One moment, Ben was there, his silhouette framed by the fading light. The next, he was gone, swallowed by the shadows. I ran after him, my heart hammering in my chest, the air around me growing colder with every step. The others called out behind me, their voices frantic, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The forest was different now, the trees closer together, their branches twisting above me, blocking out what little light remained. I heard him scream. It wasn't a sound I'd ever forget. It wasn't just fear. It was pain, raw and visceral, cutting through the silence like a blade. It came from somewhere up ahead, deeper into the forest, but when I reached the spot, there was nothing. No sign of Ben. No footprints. Just the trees, standing tall and silent, their bark dark and glistening, as though wet with something that wasn't water. The whispers started then. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing, but they grew louder, threading through the air like a melody played just out of tune. They weren't voices, not really. They were more like thoughts, fragmented and disjointed, pressing against my mind in a way that made my skin crawl. I turned back toward the clearing, but the path was gone. The forest had changed again. The trees were closer now, their twisted branches forming a canopy so dense it felt like night had fallen. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, its beam weak and flickering. The whispers grew louder, their tone shifting, becoming more urgent, more insistent. My name was among them, clear and distinct, spoken in a voice I didn't recognize but somehow knew. I stumbled back into the clearing, or what I thought was the clearing. The house was still there, its dark silhouette looming against the blackened sky. But something about it was different. The windows were glowing faintly, a pale, sickly light that pulsed in time with the whispers. The door was wide open now, and inside I could see movement, not people, shadows, seeming. They flickered and twisted, their forms barely more than suggestions, but they were there, writhing in the pale light like smoke caught in a draught. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step closer, the air growing heavier, colder. The whispers surged, louder now, almost frantic, pulling at me, urging me forward. And then I saw it. In the doorway stood a figure, its form tall and gaunt, its face obscured by the shadows that clung to it like a second skin. It didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, like the weight of the entire forest pressing down on me. The whispers quieted, their chaotic voices fading into a single, low murmur. Stay. The word wasn't spoken. It was felt, a vibration that rippled through the air, through my chest, through my mind. My legs trembled, my body frozen in place as the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its hollow gaze fixed on me. The whispers surged again, chaotic and deafening, and I turned and ran, the forest swallowing me whole. The forest felt alive, but not in the way nature should be. Every step I took seemed to disturb something unseen, something ancient that watched from just beyond the edges of my vision. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were quieter now, but no less intrusive, threading through my mind like tendrils of smoke, curling into thoughts that weren't my own. The path, if it could still be called that, wound deeper into the trees, narrowing until I had to push branches aside to move forward. The bark was rough against my palms, slick with dampness that left dark stains on my hands. I didn't dare stop. The memory of that figure at the house loomed in my mind, its hollow presence pressing against my thoughts, urging me to keep moving. The others were behind me somewhere, calling my name, their voices muffled and distant, as though the forest had swallowed them whole. I wanted to shout back, to tell them to stay away, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, my breaths shallow, my heartbeat a relentless drum beat in my ears. The air was heavier now, colder, filled with the faint metallic tang of something wrong. I nearly tripped over the first one. It was a pile of stones, weathered and uneven, stacked haphazardly at the base of a tree. At first I thought it was just an old cairn, a marker left by someone who had passed this way long before me. But as I crouched down, shining my flashlight over it, I saw the carvings. Jagged lines etched into the stones, faint and worn, but unmistakable. Symbols, not random, but deliberate, their shapes twisting and overlapping in a pattern that made my head throb when I tried to focus on them. The whispers surged. They rose in a chaotic crescendo, their voices clashing and overlapping, filling the air with a sound that wasn't quite human. I stumbled back, the flashlight beam shaking as it illuminated the ground around the cairn. There were more of them, dozens, scattered in a rough circle around the tree, each one carved with the same symbols, their lines glowing faintly in the darkness. The tree itself was massive, its trunk gnarled and twisted, its bark darker than any of the others around it. It looked almost burnt, the surface rough and cracked, as though it had been scorched by fire, but never fully consumed. The branches reached upward like skeletal arms, their tips sharp and claw-like, stretching toward the sky that I couldn't see. I didn't want to get closer. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, to run. But the whispers didn't give me a choice. They pulled at me, an invisible thread winding tighter and tighter, dragging me toward the tree, toward the cairns, toward the thing I could feel waiting beneath the surface. My flashlight flickered as I stepped into the circle. The air here was colder, sharper, cutting through my skin like a blade. The ground beneath my boots was soft, almost spongy, as though the earth itself was decaying. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, threading through the air, through my thoughts, weaving a tapestry of fear and desperation that I couldn't escape. At the base of the tree was something else. Echo. It wasn't a cairn. It was a figure, slumped against the trunk, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, its head bowed. My flashlight beam trembled as I swept it over the body. the light catching on pale, waxy skin, stretched too tightly over bones. The symbols from the stones were etched into its chest, the lines jagged and deep, as though they had been carved with a dull blade. The whispers surged again, their tones shifting, more urgent, more demanding. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my body frozen as the figure slowly raised its head. Its eyes were gone. The sockets were empty, hollow voids that seemed to pull at the edges of my vision, drawing me in. Its mouth moved, the words barely audible over the whispers, but I heard them as clearly as if they had been spoken directly into my mind. Leave, it rasped, its voice broken and raw, each word a struggle, before it takes you. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, their voices clashing and colliding, drowning out everything else. The figure's body convulsed, its limbs jerking violently, as though pulled by invisible strings. Wah! And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The figure slumped forward, its head bowing once more, and the whispers fell silent. The silence was worse. It pressed against me, heavy and suffocating, filling the void left by the whispers. The air around me grew colder still, the metallic tang sharper, making my stomach churn. I took a step back, then another, my flashlight beam shaking as it swept over the tree, the cairns, the body, the ground beneath me shifted. It wasn't much, just a faint vibration, a subtle movement, but it was enough to send a wave of panic through me, sharp and visceral, as though the earth itself was waking up. The symbols on the stones glowed brighter, their jagged lines pulsing faintly, and I felt the pull again, stronger this time, dragging me toward the tree, toward the thing that waited beneath it. I turned and ran. The forest closed in around me, the trees pressing closer, their branches clawing at my arms and legs, their roots snagging at my boots. The air was colder now, filled with the faint hum of something alive, something ancient. The whispers returned, softer now, threading through the darkness like a melody just out of reach. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The pull was still there, an invisible hand reaching for me, trying to drag me back to the tree, to the cairns, to the hollow void that had claimed this place as its own. My breaths came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning my throat, my heart pounding in my chest like a drumbeat. And then I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling my name. It wasn't one of the others. It couldn't be. But I turned toward it anyway, my flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the darkness. The figure from the tree was standing just a few feet away. It stood there, unmoving, its hollow eyes fixed on me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath, too. My flashlight trembled in my grip, the beam unsteady as it illuminated the figure. It hadn't changed, its pale, waxy skin stretched impossibly tight over its bones, the jagged symbols etched into its chest, still glowing faintly. But now, It was standing. And it was watching me. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey, locked in place by a fear so intense. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. The whispers had fallen silent again, leaving only the pounding of my heart to fill the oppressive stillness. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, like the forest itself had condensed into this one hollow, lifeless form. Then it took a step forward. The sound was faint, just a soft shuffle of dirt and leaves, but it was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. I stumbled back, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly, the trees around me twisting and stretching in the distorted light. The figure moved again, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Its head tilted slightly, the empty sockets of its eyes seeming to follow me no matter where I turned. The whispers returned. They surged all at once, loud and chaotic, crashing through the silence like a tidal wave. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were words, fragmented and overlapping, pressing against my thoughts, twisting them into shapes that weren't my own. I couldn't understand them, but I could feel them, their meaning sinking deep into my chest, cold and heavy. The figure took another step, and another. Its movements deliberate, its presence consuming. The forest seemed to shift around it, the trees bending and swaying, as though bowing to its will. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath burning in my throat, and the metallic tang returned, stronger now, filling my lungs with every ragged inhale. I turned and ran. The forest blurred around me, the shadows stretching and twisting, their forms flickering like flames caught in a gust of wind. The ground beneath my boots was uneven, the roots and stones tripping me at every step. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. You stop. The whispers followed me, their voices threading through the air, through my thoughts, pulling at the edges of my mind. The path, if it could still be called that, was barely visible now, swallowed by the darkness that pressed in from all sides. My flashlight flickered, its weak beam cutting through the gloom in short, stuttering bursts. I could hear it behind me, the faint shuffling of dirt and leaves, the sound of something moving through the forest, slow but relentless. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I kept going, pushing through the underbrush, the branches clawing at my arms and face. The whispers were louder now, their tone shifting, growing more urgent, more insistent. They weren't just noise. They were commands. Turn around. You. I didn't. I couldn't. The thought of seeing that thing again, of looking into those hollow eyes, was enough to drive me forward, even as my body screamed for rest. The air around me felt alive, charged with an energy that prickled at my skin, sinking into my bones. The forest wasn't just watching me anymore. It was hunting me. It was hunting me. I broke through the trees and into a clearing. For a moment, I thought I had found safety, but the sight before me sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over me. The clearing was dominated by a massive stone circle, its jagged edges rising high into the air, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. Symbols were carved into the stones, their lines glowing faintly, pulsing in time with the whispers. At the center of the circle was an altar, its surface dark and uneven, slick with something that glistened in the faint light. I stumbled to a stop, my chest heaving, my eyes darting around the clearing. The air here was different, thicker, heavier, filled with a hum that vibrated through my body, through my thoughts. The whispers grew louder, their chaotic voices blending into a single low resonance that seemed to echo from the stones themselves. I wasn't alone. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the circle, its hollow gaze fixed on the altar. It didn't move, didn't react to me, but its presence was no less suffocating. The shadows around it shifted and twisted, their forms flickering like flames, their edges sharp and jagged. The forest had brought me here, I realized. It had been guiding me all along, pulling me toward this place, toward whatever ancient, malevolent force lay at its heart. The whispers shifted again, their tone rising, almost pleading. They weren't speaking to me anymore. Do this, Shuvada, teach you. They were speaking through me, their words threading through my thoughts, filling my mind with images of things I couldn't understand, twisted shapes, endless voids, the hollow, lifeless faces of the things that had come before me. The figure turned. Its movements were slow, deliberate, its hollow gaze locking onto mine. The air grew colder, the hum rising to a deafening pitch, and I felt the pull again, stronger now, dragging me toward the circle, toward the altar, toward the thing that waited beneath it. My legs moved without my consent, my body obeying the forest's will, even as my mind screamed in protest. The altar loomed before me, its surface slick and dark, the symbols carved into its edges, glowing brighter, sharper. The whispers rose to a frantic crescendo, their voices clashing and overlapping, filling the clearing with a sound that was both overwhelming and hollow. The figure stood just beyond the stones, its hollow eyes watching, waiting. I reached the altar. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on me like the weight of the forest itself. The air was still, the shadows frozen, the glowing symbols dimming slightly, their light pulsing weakly. For a moment, I thought it was over. And then, the ground beneath me began to move. The ground beneath me shifted like a living thing, pulsing in rhythm with the faint glow of the symbols carved into the altar. The hum that had vibrated in the air was now in the earth itself, resonating up through my legs, my chest, into my skull. I stumbled back, the sensation so alien, so wrong, that it made my stomach churn. But no matter how far I moved, the pull of the altar remained, invisible and unrelenting. The whispers returned, softer now, threading through the silence like needles. They weren't chaotic this time. They were focused, deliberate, pushing thoughts into my mind that weren't my own. They weren't asking for anything. They were telling me, shh, ah, they were telling me, stay, bah, demon, witness. The air thickened, pressing against my skin like damp cloth. The shadows at the edge of the clearing shifted, their forms flickering and unstable, almost human, but not. They swayed and twisted, their movements synchronized, as though they were responding to the altar's silent command. My flashlight sputtered weakly in my grip, its beam trembling as it cut through the gloom. And then the earth cracked. It wasn't a violent break, not at first, just a subtle fracture running beneath the altar, its edges glowing faintly with the same sickly light as the symbols. But the crack spread, its lines jagged and unnatural, splitting the ground in two and releasing a faint hiss of air that reeked of decay and damp stone. The hum intensified, the vibrations growing stronger, more insistent, and the altar itself began to tremble. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot by a fear so visceral it was all-consuming. The whispers grew louder, their tone shifting to something almost euphoric, as if they were welcoming something into the world. My eyes were fixed on the crack beneath the altar, the faint light spilling out in uneven pulses, growing brighter, sharper. A hand emerged. At least, it looked like a hand, pale and gaunt, its fingers unnaturally long, its joints bending at angles that shouldn't have been possible. It gripped the edge of the altar, pulling itself upward with a slow, deliberate motion, its movements almost mechanical. Another hand followed, its claw-like fingers scraping against the stone, leaving deep grooves in its surface. And then it rose. And the thing that pulled itself from the earth wasn't human, but it had the shape of one, a twisted, hollow mimicry of a person. Its limbs were impossibly thin, its joints too sharp, its skin stretched tight over a frame that didn't look like it should hold together. Its head was featureless, smooth and pale, with no eyes, no mouth, just a blank slate where a face should have been. Yet I could feel it watching me, its attention suffocating like a spotlight trained on my soul. The whispers surged, their voices frantic, triumphant, echoing through the clearing with a resonance that made my head throb. The shadows at the edges of the circle pressed closer, their forms flickering like flames, their movements faster now, more erratic. The thing from the altar didn't move. It stood there, towering and still, its featureless head tilted slightly, as though studying me. The pull grew stronger. I took a step back, then another, my breaths shallow and uneven, my flashlight beam shaking as it illuminated the thing in front of me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, threading through my thoughts with a clarity that made my skin crawl. They weren't just thoughts anymore. They were images, fragments of something ancient and incomprehensible. I saw the stones being raised, the symbols being carved, the altar soaked in blood that wasn't entirely human. I saw faces, hollow and lifeless, staring back at me from the darkness. And I saw myself. Everyone vitala. The vision was brief, just a flash, but it was enough. And who, or ma, but it was enough to make me understand, enough to make me want to scream. Then in front of me tilted its head further, its featureless gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my chest ache. The whispers surged again, their meaning undeniable. It's your turn. The ground trembled beneath my feet, the crack beneath the altar widening, spilling more of that sickly light into the clearing. The thing took a step forward, its movements slow, deliberate, each motion sending a ripple through the air that made my skin prickle. The shadows pressed closer, their forms merging into a single writhing mass that surrounded the clearing, cutting off any hope of escape. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam catching on the edge of the circle, on the jagged symbols carved into the stone. They glowed brighter now, their light pulsing in time with the thing's movements, with the whispers that filled the air. I reached for the stones, my fingers brushing against their rough surface, hoping, praying for some kind of escape. The thing lunged. It wasn't fast, but it didn't need to be. Its arms stretched impossibly far, its claw-like fingers wrapping around my wrist with a grip that was cold and unyielding. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, their voices clashing and overlapping, filling the clearing with a sound that was both overwhelming and hollow. The thing pulled me closer, its featureless head tilting downward, its presence consuming. And then it stopped. The whispers fell silent. The shadows froze, their forms motionless at the edge of the circle. The thing released me, its clawed hand retracting as it stepped back, its movements smooth and deliberate. The air around me grew colder, sharper, filled with a metallic tang that burned in my lungs. The pull was gone, replaced by an emptiness that was somehow worse. The thing turned back toward the altar, its featureless gaze fixed on the crack beneath it. The ground trembled again, the light spilling out brighter now, sharper, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. The whispers returned, softer this time, their tone almost reverent. I turned and ran. The forest closed in around me, the trees pressing closer, their branches clawing at my arms and legs, their roots snagging at my boots. The whispers followed me, threading through the air, through my thoughts, pulling at the edges of my mind. The clearing disappeared behind me, swallowed by the darkness, but I knew it wasn't over. The thing wasn't done. The forest wasn't done. We won't ga, and neither was I. I didn't stop running. The air tore at my lungs, cold and sharp, but the fear driving me was stronger than the burn in my legs or the ache in my chest. The forest blurred around me, the trees twisting and stretching, their branches clawing at me like they were alive. The whispers had changed. They weren't voices anymore. They were vibrations, pulsing through the ground, through the air, through me. Every step felt like a mistake. The forest wasn't letting me leave. It was guiding me, herding me deeper into its heart. The path I thought I was following disappeared, replaced by uneven ground that shifted and moved beneath my feet. The trees pressed closer, their trunks dark and glistening, their bark etched with symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. I stumbled into another clearing, my momentum carrying me forward until I fell to my knees. The ground here was different, soft and spongy like moss, but colder. The air was heavy with dampness, thick and suffocating, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I looked up, my flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the clearing. There was another altar. This one was smaller, simpler. Tranquil. It was made of stone, rough and uneven, its surface darkened with stains that I didn't want to think about. The same symbols from the first altar were carved into its edges, their lines jagged and crude, glowing faintly in the flickering light. Surrounding it were more of the cairns, piles of stones, stacked haphazardly, each one marked with the same carvings. There were dozens of them, arranged in a rough circle around the altar, their presence oppressive and wrong. The whispers surged. They rose from the ground, threading through the air, filling the clearing with a sound that wasn't quite noise. It was a feeling, heavy and all-encompassing, pressing against my skin, my mind, my chest. The cairns seemed to tremble in response, their symbols glowing brighter, their jagged lines pulsing in time with the whispers. The altar hummed, its vibrations resonating through the ground, through my knees, through my bones. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. It wasn't the same as the thing I'd seen before. Not as tall, not as distorted, but it was no less raw. Its body was thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face was blank, smooth, and featureless, but its presence was suffocating, overwhelming. It stepped into the clearing, its movements slow and deliberate, its hollow gaze fixed on me. The whispers grew louder, their tone shifting, becoming more urgent, more insistent. The cairns trembled again, their light pulsing faster, brighter, casting long, jagged shadows across the clearing. The figure stopped in front of the altar, its head tilting slightly, as though it were listening. The ground beneath me shifted. It wasn't a violent movement, not at first, just a subtle tremor, a faint vibration that spread outward from the altar, rippling through the clearing. But it grew quickly, the tremors intensifying, the ground buckling and cracking beneath the figure's feet. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, their chaotic voices clashing and colliding, filling the air with a sound that was both overwhelming and hollow. The altar cracked. A thin line split its surface, jagged and uneven, spilling out a faint, sickly light. The figure didn't move. It stood there, its blank face turned toward the light, its body motionless despite the chaos around it. The cairns trembled violently, their stones shifting and falling. their symbols glowing brighter, sharper. The whispers surged, their voices merging into a single resonant tone that vibrated through the clearing, through me. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, a resonance that sank deep into my chest, threading through my thoughts, filling my mind with words that weren't my own. You are chosen. The words hit me like a physical blow, sharp and visceral, driving the air from my lungs. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, its presence consuming. The light spilling from the altar grew brighter, sharper, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. The whispers were frantic now, their tone pleading, desperate, as though they were begging me to understand. The figure reached for me. Its hand was thin, its fingers impossibly long, its joints bending at angles that shouldn't have been possible. I stumbled back, my hands scraping against the rough ground, my flashlight clattering to the earth. The beam spun wildly, illuminating the clearing in brief, stuttering flashes. The figure didn't stop. It moved closer, its hand outstretched, its blank face tilting downward, as though studying me. The ground beneath the altar shattered. The light spilled out in a torrent, blinding and searing, illuminating the clearing with an intensity that made my skin burn. The figure stopped, its head snapping toward the altar, its body jerking violently as though pulled by invisible strings. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the air, through the earth, through my chest. The altar collapsed, its stones crumbling into the light, revealing something beneath it, something vast and dark and alive. It wasn't a form, not exactly. It was a presence, a void that seemed to stretch endlessly, its edges flickering and unstable, its surface rippling like liquid shadow. The figure stepped back, its blank face turned toward the void, its movements hesitant, uncertain. The void pulsed. It was a subtle movement, barely perceptible, but it sent a wave of cold air through the clearing, sharp and biting, carrying the metallic tang of decay. The cairns trembled, their stones shifting and falling, their symbols fading into darkness. The figure froze, its body rigid, its presence smaller now, less consuming. The void pulsed again. The ground beneath me trembled, the vibrations rising through my legs, my chest, my skull. The whispers returned, softer now, their tone almost reverent, as though they were bowing to whatever had emerged from the altar. The figure turned toward me, its blank face tilting slightly, its hollow gaze fixed on mine. You must give. The words weren't a command. They were a fact, undeniable and absolute, sinking deep into my thoughts, wrapping around my mind like a vice. The void pulsed again, its rippling surface stretching toward me, consuming the light, the shadows, the clearing itself. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. The forest had already made its choice. And I was the offering. The void rippled, its surface alive with motion, that defied understanding. The clearing around me felt smaller, shrinking with every pulsing beat that emanated from the darkness beneath the shattered altar. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest, my legs, my mind, until every breath felt like a battle. Every step a struggle against an unseen force. I could feel it watching me, not the figure, but the void itself. It wasn't just a presence. It was an intelligence, vast and unknowable, stretching into the space around me, through me. The whispers had faded, replaced by a low hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones, resonating in time with the pulsing light from the altar. My legs trembled as I stood, my flashlight flickering weakly in my hand. The figure moved again, its motions jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by strings. It stepped closer to the void, its blank face turned toward it, the jagged symbols carved into its chest glowing faintly in the darkness. The air around it rippled, distorting its form, bending it into shapes that didn't make sense, didn't belong. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to break the stillness that had wrapped around me like a vice, but my body refused to move. The void pulsed again, stronger this time, sending a wave of cold air through the clearing. The figure froze, its limbs rigid, its head snapping toward me with an unnatural speed that made my stomach churn. I felt its hollow gaze pierce through me, heavy and unrelenting, and for a moment I thought it might speak, but it didn't need to. And the forest was already speaking for it. Give yourself. The words weren't spoken. They were pressed into my mind, sinking deep like hooks, wrapping around my thoughts until I couldn't tell where they ended and I began. The hum grew louder, sharper, vibrating through the clearing with an intensity that made my teeth ache. The ground beneath my feet shifted, the earth cracking and groaning as though it were alive, struggling to contain the thing that was breaking free. The void stretched toward me. Tranquil stretched toward me. Its surface rippled like water, tendrils of darkness reaching out, twisting and writhing as they moved. They weren't physical, not exactly. They were more like shadows, impossibly dark, impossibly deep, pulling at the edges of the light, devouring everything in their path. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam shaking as it cut through the darkness, its weak light swallowed almost instantly by the void's endless hunger. The figure followed me, its movements slow and deliberate, its blank face tilting slightly as it stepped closer. The symbols on its chest glowed brighter, their jagged lines pulsing in time with the void, with the hum, with the frantic pounding of my heart. It reached for me, its long, thin fingers outstretched, and I felt the pull again, stronger now, more insistent, dragging me toward the altar, toward the void, toward the thing that was waiting for me. I fell, eerie. My knees hit the ground hard, the impact jarring, but the pain barely registered. The air was too thick, too cold, burning in my throat. With every ragged breath, my flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam spinning wildly, illuminating the clearing in brief, stuttering flashes. The shadows around the edge of the clearing flickered, their forms merging and splitting, their movements frantic and chaotic. The void pulsed again, and this time the clearing itself seemed to shift, the trees bending inward, their branches stretching toward the center, toward the altar, toward me. The figure stopped in front of me, its blank face lowering until it was level with mine. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them boring into me, peeling back the layers of who I was, until there was nothing left but raw fear. It is time. The ground beneath me cracked, the fractures spreading outward in jagged lines that glowed faintly in the darkness. The altar trembled, its surface crumbling, spilling more of that sickly light into the clearing. The void swelled, its tendrils reaching closer, wrapping around the edges of the altar, pulling it downward, consuming it piece by piece. The whispers returned. They were louder now, a chaotic chorus of voices that clashed and overlapped, filling the clearing with a sound that was both deafening and hollow. They weren't pleading anymore. They were demanding. They wanted me to move, to stand, to give myself to the thing that waited in the void. My legs shook as I pushed myself up, my movements slow and unsteady, the pull of the altar dragging me forward with every step. The figure stepped aside, its blank face turning toward the void as though in reverence. The symbols on its chest flared, their light sharp and searing, and I felt the pull intensify, dragging me toward the altar, toward the edge of the void. The tendrils of darkness twisted and writhed, their movements almost eager, their edges sharp and jagged. I reached the altar. The whispers stopped again, leaving a silence so profound it pressed against my ears, my chest, my thoughts. The void pulsed, its surface rippling, its tendrils stretching toward me, curling around the altar, around my legs, around my mind. The figure stood motionless beside me, its presence smaller now, almost forgotten in the shadow of the thing that had claimed this place. And then it spoke again. Then it spoke again. You are the key. The words hit me like a physical force, driving me to my knees, my breath stolen from my lungs. The void pulsed one last time, its tendrils tightening around me, pulling me downward. And I knew, deep down, I knew that there was no escape. The forest had chosen me, and I couldn't fight it anymore. The pull was relentless, like a tide dragging me out to a sea of shadows. My hands clawed at the rough surface of the altar, as if anchoring myself could save me. But the void didn't care. The tendrils of darkness tightened, winding around my legs and arms, their cold seeping into my skin, deeper than bone, into something more essential. I could feel it. This thing wasn't just pulling me physically, it was unraveling me, thread by thread. The figure stood beside me, motionless, its blank face tilted toward the void as if in prayer. The jagged symbols on its chest burned brighter, casting fractured light across the clearing, illuminating the writhing shadows, the trembling cairns, the towering trees that leaned closer as though drawn to the altars, collapsing gravity. The whispers surged again, but they weren't outside anymore. They were inside me, pressing against my thoughts, shaping them, breaking them. You are the bridge. The words resonated through my chest, vibrating through every fiber of my being. They weren't a command. They were a certainty. The forest had been leading me here all along, piece by piece, stripping away the illusion of choice, of control. I wasn't just a visitor here. I was the missing part of a puzzle that had been waiting to be completed for centuries. Envelop. The tendrils yanked me forward, my body sliding across the stone, my knees scraping against its jagged surface. My flashlight had long since been swallowed by the void, its beam extinguished, leaving only the flickering light of the symbols to push back against the consuming darkness. The air was colder now, sharp as knives, each breath a struggle against the pressure that pressed down on me, forcing me to my knees. The figure moved for the first time, its thin, unnatural limbs bending as it crouched beside me. Its blank face turned toward mine, impossibly close, its presence radiating a cold so deep it felt like it was hollowing me out. The whispers in my mind softened, coalescing into a single voice. Its voice. You will open the door. I shook my head, my breath ragged, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might shatter. No, I managed to choke out, the word barely audible over the low, resonant hum that filled the air. But the figure didn't react. It didn't need to. The forest was already answering for me. The altar cracked beneath me, splitting further, the jagged lines glowing brighter, sharper, spilling more of that sickly light into the clearing. The void pulsed again, its tendrils tightening, pulling me closer, their edges slicing into my skin. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. The light from the altar dimmed, its glow fading as the void consumed it, devouring everything in its path. The figure reached for me, its long, spindly fingers brushing against my chest, against my heart. The cold intensified, spreading through me like a toxin, freezing everything it touched. I felt the symbols then, not on the altar, not on the cairns, but on me, burning into my skin, carving themselves into my thoughts, my soul, until I wasn't sure where they ended and I began. The void spoke. It wasn't a sound. It was a presence, vast and overwhelming, pressing into every corner of my mind, my body, my existence. It was ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting, watching, biding its time until the moment was right. Until I was here, the door will open. Through you, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, not into darkness, but into something deeper, something more complete. The void wasn't empty. It was filled with shapes, with motion, with things I couldn't comprehend. They twisted and writhed, their forms shifting and unstable, their edges sharp and jagged. They weren't alive, not in the way I understood, but they weren't dead either. They were waiting for me. The tendrils of darkness tightened one last time, pulling me into the void, wrapping around me until I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't feel. The whispers surged again, louder than ever, their voices clashing and colliding, forming a chaotic symphony that drowned out everything else. And then, all at once, they stopped. Silence, Ah, the, the void stilled, its motionless depths stretching endlessly in every direction. The tendrils released me, their cold fading, leaving only emptiness in their wake. The figure was gone. The altar was gone. The clearing was gone. I was alone, but I wasn't. The presence was still there, vast and all-encompassing, pressing against the edges of my mind, filling the void with its weight. It wasn't speaking anymore. Oh, isn't speaking anymore. It didn't need to. I understood now. I understood now. The symbols burned brighter in my thoughts, their meaning clear, undeniable. I wasn't the bridge. I was the key. I was the key, and the door had already been opened. Yes, the void pulsed again, and this time, it wasn't pulling me in. It was pushing me out. The forest returned in an instant, the clearing stretching out around me, unchanged but different. The cairns were still there, their stones dark and cold, their symbols faded into nothing. The altar was whole again, its surface smooth and unbroken, the light from its edges extinguished. The air was still, the shadows frozen, the trees motionless, but I wasn't the same. The whispers were gone, replaced by a silence that was heavier, more suffocating. The symbols were still there, carved into my skin, into my mind, their meaning etched into every part of me. The void had left its mark, and I knew it wasn't finished. The forest was still watching, still waiting, its presence pressing against me, wrapping around me like a shroud. I stood, my legs trembling, my breath shallow and uneven. The forest was silent, but it wasn't empty. I could feel it, just beneath the surface. The thing that had been waiting for so long. Ah, it wasn't just in the forest anymore. It was in me, and it was only the beginning. And who was